They say there's no greater pain than burying a child. But there's a pain that might not kill the body, only the soul, and it's called ingratitude. This story doesn't begin with shouting, slamming doors, or a public scene. It begins with silence. A painful, heavy silence made of empty stares, unanswered texts, rejected hugs. Because sometimes, abandonment doesn't come with suitcases at the door, it comes with the calculated distance of those who should have been closest. My name is Mary. And for many years, I believed that loving unconditionally was my role as a mother. I thought erasing myself was proof of love. That saying yes meant protection. That paying for everything emotionally and financially was just the natural price of motherhood. But then she said it. Clear as day, without blinking, without hesitation. I wish you would disappear. And that day, I did. But not from the world. I disappeared from the illusion. From the dependency. From the fantasy that to love means to give until you lose yourself. This isn't just the story of an ungrateful daughter. It's the story of a woman who lost her husband, was betrayed by her own children, emotionally cut off, and used like a walking ATM. But it's also the story of a wounded mother who chose to rise again. A woman who faced invisible grief, severed the chains of emotional manipulation, and chose emotional justice over guilt. What you're about to witness is a transformation from the inside out. A painful dive into heartbreak and disappointment, but also a breathtaking climb toward empowerment, freedom, and self-worth. Get ready, this story may poke at wounds you've never dared to face. But if you stay until the end, you might just uncover that quiet strength living inside those who are tired of suffering in silence. They say a mother's love is unconditional. They're wrong. And not because a mother stops loving, but because even the most generous heart has limits. Mary learned that too late, after she had given everything: time, youth, money, mental health, in the name of a love that was never returned. Society has cruelly romanticized motherhood. They expect women to endure everything without a sound. But hey, race, what no one says. Mothers get tired too. Mothers break too. And sometimes, what breaks never goes back to the way it was. It was there, in front of the mirror, alone, that Mary began to see the invisible where that had been eating away at her for years. Being a mother started to feel like a life sentence of endless giving with nothing in return. Every act of care was swallowed by forgetfulness. Every sacrifice washed down the drain of ungratefulness. Mary couldn't even remember the last time she had truly been heard. She wasn't a woman anymore. She was a function. An emotional and financial ATM. And over time, the forced smiles from her children became too routine. Compliments always followed by requests. Occasional affection exchanged for favors. That wasn't love. It was an emotional manipulation game, and only one side ever lost her. Society demands every mother be strong, but never asks how she feels. Mary had become an expert at hiding her pain. She cried alone in the car. Swallowed insults disguised as jokes. Heard you do it because you want to from her own children, and stayed quiet. But that strength they admired so much in her was actually chronic exhaustion disguised as patience. There was a chasm between what she gave and what she received. And in that abyss, her self-worth fell without warning. She stopped looking in the mirror. Started wearing whatever was practical. Forgot what she even liked to eat. Toxic motherhood doesn't come crashing in with shouting. It sneaks in. With sweet smiles, subtle guilt trips, and phrases like, "You're the only one who can help me." Mary said yes like she was signing an emotional blank check. Each concession felt small, but together, they built a prison. And inside that emotional cell, she shrank a little more each day. That so-called unconditional love turned into an emotional leash. An invisible, abusive contract that no one else could see. And the most dangerous part? She believed it was her destiny. It all starts with a "sure, honey." Then comes the "just this once." And by the time she realized, Mary had already sold a car to help Becca, paid 2 of Spencer's tickets, and postponed her eye surgery just to help one of them with rent. The worst part? They barely said thank you. What once looked like generosity now sounded like self-abandonment. But in that first flash of clarity, Mary felt something had to change. She didn't yet know how or when, but deep inside, something was starting to rebel. Her heart, once broken, now beat with anger. And that anger would bring strength. Because the truth is, no woman is born a mother. She becomes one. And just like that, she can become something else. Mary, without realizing it, was already taking her first steps toward freedom. The pain was starting to take shape. The bitterness was turning into clarity. The silence, once her prison, was now becoming her strategy. She didn't know what lay ahead. But one thing was certain. She would never again be anyone's doormat. What comes next isn't just drama. It's emotional justice. And you're about to witness what happens when a mother stops being a martyr and starts writing her own story. John's death was like a silent hurricane. There were no screams, no dramatic goodbye, just a dry phone call and a heart that stopped beating without warning. Mary didn't cry at the funeral. She didn't collapse into anyone's arms. She did what she always did, held the weight of the world on her shoulders and kept walking. But inside, the ground had disappeared. John had been her partner in life, her only emotional anchor. And without him, nothing made sense anymore. That was the beginning of an invisible grief, the kind nobody respects because they can't see it. But she knew something inside her had died too. The big house, once full of life, had become a tomb disguised as a home. Every room echoed the laughter of a past that would never return. Mary started getting lost in her own routine. She forgot her keys, burned meals, slept with the lights on. The mirror began reflecting a woman she no longer recognized. Vanity became a luxury that no longer fit inside her grief. Clean clothes were enough. The rest didn't matter. Slowly, John's absence morphed into emotional abandonment. Not because the kids had left, but because they had chosen not to stay. Spencer, the oldest, barely showed up. Always busy. Always with a ready excuse. He sent cold messages, rarely called. And when he did come by, it felt like a rushed visit from a distant guest. Becca, on the other hand, showed up more often, but her affection followed a script: compliments, smiles. Then came the requests for help. It was a conditional kind of love where every hug was part of a trade. Deep down, Mary felt it. But she didn't want to see it. The love she gave was genuine. The love she received was disguised interest. The worst kind of betrayal. In the loneliness of that house, filled with memories, Mary started talking to herself. To the plants. To the photos. To the silence. And in that void, old pains began to rise to the surface. She remembered the births. The sleepless nights. The fevers she fought alone. The sacrifices she made to pay for their education. Then, a cruel question bloomed in her mind. Was it all for nothing? Her broken heart wasn't just mourning John's death. It was mourning the growing ingratitude of the children she raised with everything she had. This wasn't just grief. It was rejection disguised as adult independence. Over time, Mary started to question her own worth. She thought, am I annoying? Controlling? Are they right to pull away from me? Emotional manipulation, when it comes from your own children, is subtle but devastating. Becca knew how to play the victim. She knew how to flip the script. Spencer knew how to ignore with elegance. And Mary, caught in the middle of it all, stayed silent. The pain was unbearable. But quiet. No shouting. No dramatic fights. Just the daily erosion of someone slowly becoming invisible. A wounded mother learning, the hardest way possible, that love cannot be bought with sacrifice. Still she kept trying. She baked cakes, sent kind messages, suggested family lunches. All ignored. Her grief, once centered on the death of her husband, had transformed into grief for her living children. Emotionally absent and cold. With every ignored gesture, Mary lost a little more of herself. But something inside her started to shift. A restlessness. A whisper saying you can't go on like this. For the first time she thought about herself. No big plans. No dramatic decisions. Just a spark in the middle of that brutal emptiness. Because even the most broken woman, once she decides to stand up, begins to write a new story. It was on a cloudy Tuesday that everything changed. Mary was making tea when she got a message from Leah, an old friend she rarely heard from. "You need to see this," the message said. Attached was a video. Mary hesitated before hitting play. What she saw knocked the air out of her lungs. Becca, her daughter, was at a party, laughing with others. Mocking her mother's voice, making fun of her habits. Calling her a useful fool. The jokes were all about the allowance, the gifts. The way she could get whatever she wanted with just a little performance. Mary froze. The teacup slipped from her hand. And the sound of shattering porcelain was the only thing that echoed through the room for a few seconds. The betrayal wasn't just about money anymore. It was about love ridiculed. Everything she had done from the heart was now material for mockery. And Becca, who had cried so many times, saying she was out of options, now looked like an award-winning actress in a cruel play. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was truth. Raw. Ugly. The end of the illusion. Mary felt the ground collapse, not out of hatred, but because her heart had been shattered beyond repair. In the days that followed, she started connecting the dots. She went back through old conversations, memories she used to brush off but now looked at with different eyes. She began to notice the subtle manipulations. She had always ignored the compliments that always came right before a request, the sudden disappearances after a rare no. She remembered selling her car to help Becca escape an abusive relationship only to find out later her daughter used the money to buy a ticket to Ibiza. That's when it hit her. It had all been a performance. And she, the loving mother, had been reduced to a naive character. In a cruel, ungrateful play. But what hurt the most was realizing Spencer was part of the farce too. In a printed email he accidentally left at her house, Mary found a conversation between him and Becca. They were laughing at the excuses they used to ask for money. "Mom always falls for it. Just say it's for college or therapy," Spencer had written. It felt like being stabbed in the back twice. The son she had always defended. The one she thought was more level-headed. He had also chosen the path of betrayal. Mary wasn't just a disappointed woman. She was a mother betrayed by the very worlds she had helped create. For days, she remained in shock. No tears. No screaming. Just replaying everything in her head like a film she couldn't escape. She tried to find a justification, some kind of explanation to ease the weight. But there wasn't one. What existed was contempt dressed up as love. Their love had conditions. A script. "I love you" followed by, "Can you send me?" Mary felt reduced to a resource. A kind of financial emergency plan wearing the title of mom. And there was nothing crueler than realizing that emotional bonds had been commercialized. It was there between the shards of what was left that something inside her shifted. It wasn't a conscious decision. Not yet. But it felt like her body began rejecting the pain. Like her heart whispered enough. For the first time, Mary didn't reach out. She didn't send a message trying to understand. She didn't beg for conversation. She simply observed. And in that silence, something new began to take root. Not hate. But clarity. The certainty that the version of herself who accepted everything in the name of love was gone. And in her place, something new would rise. Something strong. Something still unknown but finally hers. That morning, Mary woke up different. There was no music. No sunshine. No cinematic revelation. Just emptiness. But it was a conscious emptiness. Like she had wiped the mirror clean for the first time and finally saw herself clearly. A single thought came to her, as powerful as a baptism: Mary White is gone. And someone new has taken her place. A tired woman had departed. In her place stood a woman who no longer wanted to be used, drained, forgotten. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. The blind love she had for her children was gone. And now she could finally see love without respect. Is self-destruction. Mary began to recall the little signs. The time Becca rolled her eyes after receiving a simple gift. The time Spencer pretended to forget her birthday. All the times she cried in secret, just to keep the peace. And she realized something brutal. While she bent over backward for them, no one ever asked if she was okay. No one ever asked if she was sleeping well, if she needed anything, if she wanted company. She had been just a support system. An emotional and financial source that wasn't allowed to run dry. But it had. And that rupture, once painful, now felt liberating. That's when she pulled out an old notebook. She didn't write a diary. She wrote a plan. A strategy. If her children treated life like a game of interests, she would learn to play too, but with dignity. Step 1: cut the access. Cancel the extra credit cards. Change the passwords. Protect what still belonged to her. They're going to freak out, she thought. But this time, she wouldn't back down. Because now she knew. Enabling the abuse had been a choice. And she had chosen it for years. Now it was time to choose herself. That's what empowerment really is. Refusing to keep accepting the unacceptable. Over the following days, she organized drawers, folders, bank accounts. She changed passwords, locked away documents, blocked access. With each action, she felt more alive. It was like she was reclaiming lost territory. A small smile bloomed each time she checked another item off the list. Mary was discovering the taste of emotional freedom. It wasn't easy. It was scary. But it was a good kind of fear. Like the flutter in your stomach before jumping out of a plane. The kind of fear that signals transformation. For the first time, she fell asleep without anxiety. The world was still the same. But she absolutely wasn't. Still, she knew. Cutting the money wasn't enough. She had to cut the pattern. Relearn how to respect herself. Learn to say no without guilt. Understand that a mother's love to be healthy must come with clear boundaries. Mary wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for peace. But peace requires posture. And she would no longer accept crumbs. She began looking at herself with more kindness. Slowly resumed old habits she had left behind. Getting her nails done. Reading in the morning. Walking while listening to music. Small things, but each of them whispered you matter. And on that path, she discovered something essential. Self-worth isn't built with grand gestures. It's built in the small, everyday choices. She didn't make any announcements. No speeches. She simply stopped responding. And every silence was a loud message. Not here anymore. Her children didn't know it yet. But the woman they knew. The one who gave in, who ran, who rescued had retired. And in her Placia new Mary was being born. Firmer. More aware. More herself. The plan had just begun. And anyone who thinks a mother isn't strong has clearly never seen what happens when she stops suffering in silence. Mary had never been a tech-savvy woman. She always preferred paper. A hardcover planner. Labeled folders, old-school style. But now, sitting at the kitchen table with a strong cup of coffee and her glasses resting firmly on her nose, she felt like a detective. What began as a basic cleanup turned into an emotional excavation. And the more she dug, the more she found. Bank statements. Receipts. Recurring transfers. Absurd PIX payments. In 5 years, she had transferred exactly $127,842 to her children. Most of it without any clear explanation. Just vague requests like "I'm in a tight spot" or "it's an emergency." It was too much money for a mother who only wanted to help. With every receipt she uncovered, Mary recalled a moment. The car she sold in a rush. The trip she cancelled. the dress she left behind in the store. She realized just how many times she had postponed her own life to prioritize her children's whims. Heart-pounding, she began building a dossier. She used sticky notes, color-coded everything, created folders: Becca lies, Spencer abuse, proof, disdain. This wasn't revenge. It was organization. It was the physical manifestation of everything she had felt for years, but never had the courage to admit. The toxic motherhood was now documented. When she accessed her old email, she found exactly what she feared, but also what she needed to see. Forwarded conversations between her children, sent by mistake. Revealed mockery, inside jokes. Even planned lies to justify asking for money. Pretend it's a panic attack. One message from Becca said, "Mom can't say no when it's emotional." Mary felt nauseous. But at the same time, something strange awakened inside her. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't emotional exaggeration. It was fact. It was numbers. It was written words. And that changed everything. Now she had proof of conscious manipulation. The most painful part wasn't just knowing they had lied, but realizing they had planned the exploitation. It wasn't impulse. It was strategy. Becca had opened a savings account under a friend's name, just to receive money off the record. Spencer was investing in cryptocurrency, never once mentioning it to his mother. Mary wasn't a present, loving mom to them. She was a retirement plan, an unpaid sponsor. When she finished organizing everything, she cried. But not from pain. She cried for having finally opened her eyes. Now everything was clear. And with clarity comes power. By the end of the week, the dossier was complete. It had physical folders and digital backups, screenshots, bank statements, spreadsheets, audio clips, even photos of expensive gifts her children claimed they couldn't afford. Mary looked at that material like someone staring at ruins. The honest ruins of a broken relationship. A relationship that pretended to be love but was really just emotional and financial exploitation. She didn't yet know how she would confront them. But one thing was clear. When the time came, there would be no way out. For the first time, she would be the one in control. And the era of submission was over. Deep down, Mary didn't want to destroy anyone. She just wanted to protect herself. And by building that dossier, that's exactly what she did. She built her own shield. Something to hold if needed. Something that said, "I know and I won't be fooled again." The next stage would demand courage. The direct confrontation was near. And though fear knocked at the door, a new voice echoed inside her, saying, "You've got this." Because whoever survives abandonment, disappointment, and financial betrayal no longer fears the truth. She was ready. And nothing was going to stop her now. Becca showed up unannounced. As always, with a smile just a little too light for someone who never asked how her mother was really doing. "Hey Mom. I missed you," she said, already removing her sunglasses. Mary knew what that meant. Whenever Becca came without warning, she came with a reason. To ask for something. And that day was no different. After 15 minutes of small talk, came the classic theatrical sigh. "Mom, you know I hate to do this, but I really need." Before she could finish, Mary reached across the table and handed her an envelope. "Read this first," she said calmly. Inside the envelope, Becca found a printed copy of the party video, screenshots of emails, text message threads, and bank transfer statements. "What is this, Mom?" Becca asked, trying to keep her cool. "It's what I know. Everything. Every lie, every manipulation. Every dollar that left this house without truth," Mary replied. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She spoke with the calm strength of someone choosing herself for the first time. Becca, visibly shaken, started laughing nervously. "You're overreacting. This is all in your head. But Mary simply pointed to the open dossier on the table. It's not in my head. It's all right here. That day, Mary didn't get an apology. No tears. No hugs. Just a long silence. Becca got up and left speechless. Mask cracked. Mary didn't chase her. She didn't send a message later. Didn't ask how she felt. Because that day wasn't about Becca. It was about Mary. About the woman who had been used, dismissed, betrayed, and who still had the courage to rise. She stood in front of the mirror, looked herself in the eye, and smiled. Not because everything was fine, but because, finally, she was free. Freedom doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it looks like peace, like silence, like a phone that doesn't ring, like a coffee made just the way you like it, like a walk in the sun, like being enough for yourself. Mary didn't need closure from anyone. She had given herself the ending she deserved. And from here on out, she would no longer live as a character in someone else's story. She was the author now. And her next chapter would be written in her own voice. Becca tried to switch tactics. She started to cry. Mom, forgive me. I was lost, I messed up, but it's because I've always needed you. Mary felt that old urge rise again to hug, to protect. But she stood firm. You don't need me. You need boundaries. And that's what I came here to learn to give you. For the first time, a mother's love didn't show up as rescue but as emotional consequence. Because love without responsibility turns into poison. And Mary knew that, in that moment. She had to become the antidote to her own story. Her daughter pushed further. So you're just going to abandon me? After everything? Mary took a deep breath. You abandoned me a long time ago, Becca. You just didn't notice. Now, I'm simply returning the absence. It was a hard hit, but a fair one. The conversation continued, filled with attempts at justification, promises to change, manipulative arguments. But Mary remained unshaken. The submissive woman she once was had stayed behind. Now, she was the guardian of her own peace. And peace, in that moment, meant not giving in. Not repeating the same mistakes. Becca didn't understand it. But for the first time, she respected it. Before leaving, Becca played one last card. You're doing this out of revenge? Mary gave a soft smile. No. I'm doing it for me. And with that, she ended the conversation. Becca left angry, confused. And Mary exhaled. It felt as if a decade's worth of weight had been lifted off her shoulders. The house was silent again. But now, it was a good kind of silence. A silence of someone who knows they've finally chosen themselves. The confrontation hadn't been easy. But it was necessary. And more than anything, it was liberating. Sometimes, saying no is the deepest act of self-love there is. That night, Mary slept like she hadn't in years. Her pillow felt lighter. Her body too. She knew Spencer would be next. And she also knew what was coming would require strength. But something inside her had shifted. She was no longer afraid. Because when a woman realizes she doesn't need anyone else's approval to accept herself, no one can control her anymore. Empowerment doesn't come from yelling louder, but from keeping your voice calm when everyone expects you to break. And Mary would not break anymore. The war wasn't over. But the battlefield now belonged to her. Mary spent the following days in silence. Not the silence of suffering, but of strategy. While the world carried on outside, she reviewed documents, met with lawyers, and made decisions that would forever change her relationship with her children. The first measure. She rewrote her will. Spencer and Becca, once listed as her primary heirs, were removed. In their place, she named a non-profit that supports women in vulnerable situations. If I'm going to leave a legacy, she thought, let it be for those who never used me. It wasn't retaliation. It was emotional justice. She also took financial measures, created new passwords, closed joint accounts, set up alerts for all transactions, shielded her investments. For the first time in years, she felt in control. There was no more room for blackmail, no more surprises. The financial cut was a reflection of the emotional break. She had already begun. What once seemed unthinkable now simply felt logical. Because giving money to someone who doesn't respect you is feeding your own downfall. Mary had finally understood. Love isn't measured in amounts. And protection is not the same as permissiveness. Her conversation with Spencer was less emotional and more pragmatic. Unlike Becca, he didn't fake surprise. He just reacted coldly. "You're being dramatic, Mom. You've always been over the top." Mary didn't respond. She just handed him a folder filled with documents, receipts, and a handwritten note. "This is the last time I explain something you never wanted to see." Spencer read it, gave a sarcastic smile, and left without saying goodbye. Mary allowed herself to cry. Not for him, but for the confirmation that everything she had built was, in fact, more fragile than she had imagined. But tears now were no longer a sign of weakness. She changed the locks, blocked phone numbers, left the family group chats. The break was real. And, surprisingly, it didn't hurt as much as she expected. In fact, there was even a sense of relief. The peace she had been searching for was arriving. Slowly, in small doses, but real. For the first time, Mary noticed the value of her own space. The house, once a stage for so many wounds, was beginning to transform into a refuge. The painful memories were still there, but something stronger had been born. Healthy boundaries. And that changed everything. She didn't look for public justifications. She didn't post vague messages. She didn't give speeches. She just lived. Simple as that. She changed the living room decor. Threw away gifts that only existed to maintain toxic ties. Started leaving notes for herself on the mirror. "You are enough. You deserve respect. You are not alone." Little reminders that acted like anchors of identity. Because breaking away from others is hard. But rebuilding yourself? That's the real journey. Mary was on that path. And the most beautiful part was, she didn't want applause. Just peace. The messages came later. Requests for explanations. Emotional guilt trips. The classic guilt letter. Written by Becca. Accusing Mary of destroying the family. She read it. Took a deep breath. And didn't respond. She had learned that not everything needs an answer. That silence, sometimes, is the most dignified end to a conversation. That was never honest to begin with. Mary hadn't turned to stone. She was still sensitive. Still human. But now she was a wounded mother, who had chosen to heal. Even if that meant leaving her children in the past. Because love, when it turns into a prison, must be set free. And she had just turned the key. The following days were strangely calm. Mary no longer woke up to desperate messages. No more staged crying. No more false emergencies. For the first time in a long time, a silent phone was a relief. Not a trigger for anxiety. The house felt bigger. Not because anything physical had changed, but because the emotional weight had been lifted from every room. The air felt lighter. The solitude, once suffocating, now sounded like freedom. And in that newly cleared space, she began to reconnect with something long forgotten. Her own identity. She reopened her bookshelf, dusted it off, brought out the titles she once loved, and others she had always wanted to read. She started with The Gifts of Imperfection by Brené Brown, and saw herself in its pages. Then came Women Who Run with the Wolves, and she cried. Each book felt like a mirror, and also a compass. Mary rediscovered the joy of learning without obligation, of diving into stories that weren't centered on pain. She began jotting down sentences that touched her, creating a personal journal of reflections. It was the beginning of a new practice, feeding herself with healing ideas instead of harmful relationships. Getting out of the house was the next step. At first, just small outings. To the market, to the cafe on the corner. Then, watercolor classes. Something she had always wanted to do, but never found time for. There was always something more urgent, she thought. But now, the urgency was herself. She met other women with similar stories. Mothers, grandmothers, caregivers. And for the first time, she felt understood. That informal support network became emotional fuel. They laughed together, cried together, shared recipes and traumas. It was beautiful. It was human. It was a reminder. No one has to rebuild themselves alone. Mary also started doing volunteer work. She signed up for a program offering tutoring to teenagers in vulnerable situations. There, she felt like she truly made a difference. Without being exploited. Without being manipulated. The exchange was pure, direct, and real. A simple "thank you, Miss Mary," was enough to fill her heart. More than teaching. She was learning. In those kids' eyes, she saw a sincerity she hadn't seen in her own children for years. And she understood. Her love didn't have to die. It just needed new destinations. Fairer relationships. Connections rooted in truth. Weekends, once consumed with solving her kids' problems, were now reserved for self-care. Homemade spa days. Classic movies. Red wine. She rediscovered her love for blues music and found that dancing alone in the kitchen was deeply therapeutic. She began recording small victories in her journal. Today I walked 4 kilometers. Today I smiled for no reason. Today, I didn't think about them at all. Each sentence was proof that her rebirth was underway. The woman emerging from that space wasn't perfect, but she was free. And within her imperfections, a new version of herself was blooming. Stronger, lighter, more whole. Of course, there were still moments of longing. Mary was made of memories, too. But now, she knew she didn't have to hold on to what hurt. She didn't deny the past. She just didn't live in it anymore. And when she looked in the mirror, she no longer saw just a wounded mother. She saw a whole woman. A woman who had been reborn from pain, who had turned grief into a bridge, not a prison. And above all, a woman who had learned that love should never be begged for. Love is meant to be shared. And if it doesn't come with reciprocity, then let it go. Because she already had everything she needed herself. The news arrived the way modern tragedies do, through WhatsApp. A rushed voice message from an acquaintance said, "Did you hear what happened to Becca? She's been arrested, Mary." Fraud. Forgery. Financial scams. Mary felt her stomach sink. It wasn't exactly a surprise. More like the confirmation of something she had always feared. And maybe, deep down, already knew would happen. Still it hurt. She was her daughter. Part of her. And at the same time, someone she no longer recognized. Soon, the phone calls came. Lawyers, acquaintances, old friends. All with one goal. To get Mary to change her mind. "She's your daughter," they said. "She doesn't deserve to be left like this." But none of them knew what Mary knew. None of them had lived what she had lived. And the cruelest part was realizing that even at rock bottom, Becca was still using the same old strategy. She called, crying, claiming she was innocent, that she had been manipulated, that she just needed money to hire a lawyer and prove her side of the story. But now, Mary could see beyond the tears. She saw the manipulation disguised as desperation. Mary listened to the entire message. Every guilt-laced word. But she didn't reply. 2 days later, she sent only one sentence in writing. I am your mother, but I am no longer your victim. There was no insult, no hatred, just dignity. According to those who witnessed it, Becca was in shock. She thought that crying would be enough to reverse everything. But Mary was different now. And that kind of emotional blackmail no longer had power over her. That one sentence spread among their circles like a legend. Some judged her. Others applauded. But to Mary, none of that mattered. What mattered was that, for the first time, she was living on her own terms. Spencer tried to step in. He said she was being cruel. Family is family, no matter the mistakes, he argued. Mary responded calmly. Family is no excuse for abuse. And then she hung up. For the first time, she didn't feel guilty afterward. She didn't lose sleep. She knew Becca's pain was real, but she also knew it was the direct result of Becca's own choices. Mary refused to keep being the safe harbor for someone who only came back when they were drowning. It was painful, of course, but it was necessary. Because love can't be a cage. It has to be free and responsible. In the months that followed, Mary stayed strong. She received occasional updates but didn't get involved. Becca reached out again, this time saying she wanted to change, that she was going to therapy. Mary hoped it was true, but she also knew that change takes time. And even then, she wasn't obligated to be the bridge, the shoulder, or the savior. Becca would have to rebuild herself. On her own. For the first time, Mary was choosing herself with conviction. It was a hard lesson for everyone. But as she wrote in her journal, sometimes, the only way to save someone is to let them drown in their own actions. She felt everything. Longing, sadness, nostalgia. But alongside those feelings came something new. Peace. A kind of serenity that only blooms when you finally choose to stop bleeding for those who keep cutting you. Mary had walked through the valley of tears, faced the monsters of guilt and emotional dependence, and now she stood on firmer ground. She could still feel the winds of pain, but now her feet were planted. And more importantly, her heart was full of something she never thought she'd feel again: pride in herself. Mary now woke up to the sound of birds, not notifications. The house was the same, but everything inside it felt different. The walls seemed more alive. The silence, once painful, was now comforting. And solitude had turned into freedom. For the first time, she could make simple choices like drinking tea on the porch or spending the afternoon reading without feeling guilty. Her children's absence was no longer an open wound. It was a scar. And scars don't hurt, they just prove there was a battle, but also that there was healing. She had crossed the worst of it. And on the other side, she had found something precious: inner peace. She spent a lot of time reflecting on what it really means to be a good mother. Is it the one who never says no? Who gives everything? Who sacrifices herself until she disappears? Or is a good mother also a whole woman? Someone who leads by example? Who shows that love should never be confused with servitude? Mary now understood. Raising children doesn't mean raising dependents. It means shaping human beings who know how to live with dignity, especially when they're told no. And ironically, by stepping away, she had made her greatest act of love. She gave her children the chance to grow with responsibility. She recorded those thoughts in her journal. It wasn't just a regular diary, but almost a letter to her future self. In it, she wrote things like, "The woman I used to be died of exhaustion. The one who was born in her place lives with awareness." Each page became a kind of anchor, a reminder of everything she had learned. There was no rush anymore. She didn't have to prove anything to anyone. Not to win back love, not to justify herself. She only needed to live. And that, in itself, was revolutionary. Because living in peace, after so much pain, is an act of self-worth. Her afternoons became sacred. Mary would prepare her favorite tea, put on soft instrumental music, sit on the porch, and simply exist. Sometimes, she smiled for no reason. Other times, she cried without shame. It was as if, finally, she had given herself permission to feel. And feeling was good. There were no more outside urgencies. Just her, the present moment, and the calm certainty of someone who had done everything she could and now was doing something for herself. There was no going back to the old Mary, the one who said yes out of fear of being rejected. The one who believed love meant enduring everything in silence. Some people still asked about Becca and Spencer, and Mary would reply with serenity. They're following their own paths. No bitterness, no sarcasm, just the truth. Because she, too, was following hers. And that path no longer involved losing herself for others. Her days now had taste, smell, color. The lightness didn't come from the absence of problems, but from the absence of unnecessary emotional weight. Her rebirth hadn't been a miracle. It had been a choice, a collection of hard decisions. But more than anything, it had been an act of self-love. The most radical and necessary one she had ever lived. Relearning to trust herself didn't happen overnight. It was like learning to walk again. After years of crawling, some mornings still came with doubt, with memories knocking on the door uninvited. But Mary had become good at recognizing her own patterns. Whenever she felt like messaging Becca, she would pause, reread her journal, and ask herself, is this coming from love? Or from emotional hunger? That self-inquiry became part of her routine, a new emotional muscle. And every time she chose silence, she grew stronger. Every hour's another brick in the foundation of her new self. Spirituality also entered her life. Softly, without expectations. Mary didn't become religious, but she began meditating. Practicing gratitude before bed. Writing down 3 good things about each day, even on the simplest ones. Today I baked bread and it rose perfectly, she'd write. Or, a neighbor smiled at me on the street. Small things, but they added flavor to her life. Because after so much disappointment, beauty lived in simplicity. And she had learned how to see it. And the most beautiful part was this. She no longer needed grand gestures or external validation. The love she felt now was internal, and that was enough. Her relationship with time changed too. Before, Mary lived in a constant state of urgency, rushing to solve things, putting out fires, trying to save everyone else. Now, she chose where to place her energy, and with that, she began to live more slowly, to wake up without rushing, to walk while feeling the breeze, to listen to old songs with real attention. It might have seemed trivial to an outsider, but to her, it was freedom. Because a life without guilt is a life that breathes. And Mary, finally, was breathing with open lungs. And a clean soul. Sometimes, she'd catch herself looking through old photos. And she'd feel a mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for what once was. Gratitude for what she had learned. There was no regret, only acceptance. She had done the best she could. With what she knew at the time. Now, she knew more. And with that knowledge, she made better choices. She understood that consequences are not punishments, they're opportunities. Becca and Spencer were facing their own. And she was finally reaping hers. Because every well-done cut hurts at first, but brings relief later. Mary had made her cuts with clarity. And now, she was harvesting the fruits of her courage. She also started writing fictional letters. Never sent but written from the heart. Some were to herself. Others to her children. Sometimes she cried while writing. Other times, she laughed. But all of them had one thing in common: emotional freedom. She was no longer a prisoner of hope or of resentment. She was the author of her own script. and she allowed herself to rewrite it as many times as necessary. No longer Mary, the woman who settled for being second place, but Mary, who had made herself the starting point and the final destination, with all her history, with all her pain, and now, with all her dignity. Then, on a mild Sunday morning, Mary sat on her porch with a cup of tea. Beside her, an open book. No music, just the sound of the wind and the rustling of the trees. She looked up at the sky and felt a single tear run down her cheek, not from pain, but from gratitude. Gratitude for surviving, for awakening, for learning that being a mother is important, but being a woman is essential. Because, in the end, the only person she would live with until her last breath was herself. And finally, she had made peace with that companion. If you made it this far, it's because something inside you connected with this story. Maybe you are a Mary. Maybe you were. Or maybe you're just beginning to realize that loving too much without anything in return isn't a virtue. It's self-abandonment. The truth is, so many people live in silence, just like she did. People who give everything and get crumbs in return. Who smile while carrying the weight of an emotional system that only works if they erase themselves. And behind every "I'm fine," there's often a broken heart, silently screaming for justice. Not legal justice, but emotional justice. Mary's story is about motherhood, yes, but it's also about rebirth. About realizing that love without reciprocity becomes a prison, and that no one should slowly die just to keep a relationship alive. She reminds us that being a mother doesn't mean being a martyr. That real love doesn't demand constant sacrifice but presence, respect, and mutual care. It's a wake-up call for every woman who still confuses love with obligation, and a mirror for those who, at some point, allowed themselves to be drained in the name of family harmony. And now, maybe it's your turn to look at your own story with more courage. Ask yourself, how many times did you say yes when you were dying to say no? How often did you accept crumbs and convince yourself it was enough? At what point did you learn that love meant shrinking yourself to fit into others? How many versions of you had to die just to keep the peace? Those questions hurt, but they are seeds of freedom, because there's no liberation without discomfort, and no transformation without clarity. What Mary went through may sound extreme, but it's real. And most importantly, it's transformative. It doesn't matter if you're 20, 40, or 70 years old. As long as you're alive, there's still time to rebuild, to draw firm boundaries, to say enough with love, to choose yourself with respect. And maybe the greatest lesson of all is simple, yet powerful. You owe nothing to those who repeatedly chose to hurt you. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. Helping is not submission. And a bond is not a sentence. You can love and still walk away. You can wish someone well and still protect your own peace. Because love without boundaries becomes a battlefield. And no one wins when everyone's bleeding. Now, I invite you to a simple exercise. Write a letter to yourself. You don't need to show it to anyone. Write it as if you were your own Mary. Say what hurt. Say what stayed stuck inside. Say what you never had the courage to admit. Then read it out loud. Take a deep breath. Feel it. And realize that just by being here, reading these words, you've already begun the process. The journey back home. To the home that is you. If this story touched your heart in any way, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. It's not just a gesture of support. It's a way to ensure more people, just like you, have access to stories that heal, that open our eyes, and remind us of what truly matters. To never forget our own worth. Turn on the notifications. The journey continues. And I'll be right here walking with you. The journey continues. And I'll be right here walking with you.